Rain swept across the plains like a curtain drawn from the heavens, blurring the horizon, drowning the dirt roads until they glistened with mud. The storm did not relent, and through it walked Clara. Her wedding dress clung heavy and cold against her skin, torn at the hem where it had dragged through dust before the rain claimed it. She carried a small trunk in one hand, the wood swollen with damp, and in the other she gripped a shawl against her shoulders, its fabric too thin to keep out the cold. A rifle, more promise than protection, was strapped across her back. She did not walk like a bride on her way to a new life. She walked like a woman cast off, each step slower, heavier, as though the ground wished to claim her. The settlement lay quiet beneath the storm. Lanterns flickered in windows, doors stayed closed against the weather, and the few men who lingered beneath the saloon awning turned their eyes toward her without welcome. One spat into the mud, another muttered that nothing good came when the rain brought strangers. Clara kept her gaze fixed ahead, though she felt the weight of their suspicion pressing harder than the rain. The general store's porch was just within reach when her legs gave, and she stumbled, the trunk falling with a thud into the muck. She sank to her knees, dress sodden, hair plastered across her face. No one moved to help. Boots shuffled, but they remained rooted in their dryness, as though her suffering were a spectacle rather than a wound. She pressed her palm to the boards of the porch, too proud to beg, too weak to rise. It was then she heard a small voice, trembling but sure. "Did you come from heaven?" Clara lifted her head. A little girl stood just inside the shelter of the porch, freckles scattered across her cheeks, copper hair curling damp around her brow. Her eyes held no suspicion, no hardness. Only wonder. The storm rolled on, but in the space between them there was a stillness. Clara did not answer, could not. The words caught in her throat, but something broke open in her chest, an ache that was not despair, but recognition. The girl stepped forward, bare feet on the wet boards, and reached out a small hand. Clara's pride warred with her exhaustion, but at last she let the girl help her to her feet. Behind the child, a man appeared in the doorway. Broad-shouldered, hair dark and streaked with grey, his face carried lines carved deep by wind and sorrow. A scar traced from his temple to his jaw, catching the lantern light. He looked at Clara not with welcome, nor with cruelty, but with the weary patience of a man long accustomed to burdens. The child glanced back at him. "Papa," she whispered, "she came from the rain." He said nothing at first. His gaze travelled from Clara's ruined dress to the rifle on her back, then to the trunk half sunken in mud. After a long silence, he stepped onto the porch, lifted the trunk with ease, and carried it inside. "Come," he said, voice low, rough as gravel. Clara followed, too spent to question, too desperate to refuse. The house smelled of cedar logs and coffee grounds, a fire long tended but rarely shared. A rocking chair creaked in the corner, its cushions worn, a testament to hours of silence passed there. The walls bore no laughter, no touch of a woman's hand. Yet the hearth burned, and warmth reached her bones for the first time since the rain began. The man set the trunk near the wall and turned to her. "Elias," he said simply, as though offering no more than his name was all the introduction required. The little girl pressed herself against Clara's side, unafraid. "I'm Mary," she said, her freckles bright as embers in the firelight. Clara's lips parted, her voice thin from disuse. "Clara." Elias gave a small nod, neither approval nor dismissal. His eyes softened only when they fell upon his daughter. He pulled a wool blanket from the back of a chair and held it out to Clara without a word. She took it, wrapping it tight around her shoulders, feeling the weight of it press down the trembling in her body. The storm raged on outside, wind rattling the shutters, but inside the silence held. Elias moved to the rocking chair, settling into its rhythm, the wood groaning under his weight. Mary lingered beside Clara, still watching her as though the rain had delivered something more than a stranger. Clara sat on the edge of a chair, her trunk at her feet, her dress still clinging damp against her skin. She stared into the fire and felt the loneliness coil around her, heavy, suffocating. Yet beside her, a child's hand found hers, small fingers curling in trust. Clara looked down, startled by the warmth of it, and realized survival here might depend not on the town, nor even on Elias, but on the fragile thread of faith held by a freckled little girl who saw her not as forsaken, but as something miraculous. The days after the storm stretched out in a kind of uneasy quiet, marked not by welcome but by endurance. Clara rose each morning to the sounds of Elias moving about the ranch, boots on wooden floors, the scrape of a chair, the faint rattle of tack being checked in the barn. Mary's laughter was the only brightness that filled the house, soft and fleeting like birdsong at dawn. Clara folded herself into the rhythm of the household, though she did so as an outsider, a guest not fully claimed. She took up small chores without being asked. The porch swept of wind-blown leaves, clothes mended where seams had long split, windows wiped of the dust that crept in no matter how tight the shutters. Her hands found purpose in these things, though her heart remained heavy. At night she listened to the creak of Elias' rocking chair near the hearth, a sound steady as a clock, its rhythm marking the silence between them. He smoked his pipe in long, patient draws, the ember flaring, fading, flaring again. Clara sat apart, her shawl drawn close, mending or knitting by firelight until her eyes burned. Their words were few, but the weight of what was unsaid pressed down like a second roof. The shadows followed her even in this place. In the stillness of night she remembered the vows whispered at an altar, the promises that had dissolved before they were ever lived. She thought of her family, poor and proud, who had pressed her into marriage as though it were a salvation. She thought of the shame that would follow her if she turned back east, empty-handed, no ring, no home, nothing to show but a dress ruined by rain. The fire crackled, but it could not burn those thoughts away. Elias carried his own ghosts, though he gave no voice to them. Clara saw the signs in passing. The wooden box he kept in the cupboard opened once when he thought no one watched. Inside, she caught a glimpse of braided hair tied with a faded ribbon. She turned away quickly, her heart struck by the intimacy of a grief not her own. In the shed she found a rocking horse half carved, its shape abandoned mid-creation, tools laid aside as if the hand that once shaped it had lost the strength to continue. She did not ask questions. Some silences, she sensed, were sacred. When she walked into town for flour, whispers followed her. Women at the mercantile lowered their voices, men at the saloon door let their eyes linger too long. Bad luck, she heard one say. Nothing but trouble, left behind like that. She kept her head bowed, though shame flared hot in her chest. Her hands shook as she counted out the few coins she had left. It was then Elias appeared, his presence like a stone dropped in still water. He stepped into the saloon, not with anger, but with the unbending stillness that silenced men better than rage. "She's under my roof," he said, voice low, plain, without flourish. "That's the end of it." The room hushed, and though no one met his eye, no one spoke against him again. Clara stood in the doorway, the sack of flour heavy in her arms, her heart beating louder than the rain ever had. He did not speak of it after. On the ride back, he kept his eyes on the road, reins loose in his hands. Clara looked at him, at the scar carved into his face, at the steady grip that held his horse calm. She realized then that his silence was not emptiness. It was armor. Where her life had been shattered by words, promises given, promises broken, Elias had chosen to live by silence, and in that silence he shielded her. Not out of tenderness, not yet, but out of principle. That night, as the rocking chair groaned softly beside the fire, Clara stitched a torn shirt of his with needle and thread, the lamplight golden on her hands. She did not thank him. He did not ask for thanks. Yet between them, unspoken, there hung a thread as fine as the hair ribbon in his wooden box. The winter came hard, crueler than the last. Snow fell in long sheets across the valley, burying the fence posts and silencing the land until even the cattle seemed to breathe more quietly. Nights grew sharp with frost. The wind rattled through the shutters and pulled smoke from the chimney sideways into the sky. Inside, Clara tended the fire with stiff hands, adding logs until sparks leapt high and shadows stretched along the walls. Mary curled close to her, drowsy beneath a quilt, while Elias sat in his chair, pipe smoke curling around him, his silence as constant as the ticking of the clock. It was on such a night, when the storm clawed against the house with white fury, that a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps, weak but urgent, cutting through the roar of the wind. Clara froze. Elias rose, slow and deliberate, setting his pipe aside. When he opened the door, the gale nearly carried it off its hinges, and there in the snow stood a man half collapsed, his dark hair crusted with ice, his skin the color of earth and sun. An Apache. Clara's breath caught. The stories told in town were bitter, full of raids and blood and loss. She clutched Mary against her without thinking, the girl stirring in confusion. Elias did not hesitate. He reached forward, took the stranger beneath the arm, and drew him inside. Snow and mud stained the floorboards as the man stumbled, shivering so violently his teeth clicked like stones. He looked about with wild eyes, uncertain, wary of what kind of welcome he had found. Elias shut the door against the storm and guided him to the hearth. No words passed between them, not at first. Elias fetched a blanket from the chest, heavy wool, and draped it across the man's shoulders. Mary wriggled free of Clara's arms, her fear dissolving into a child's simple compassion. She carried her small quilt, patched, faded, the one she slept under each night, and placed it carefully over the stranger's knees. His eyes, dark and sharp, met hers, and for the first time since entering he bowed his head, a gesture of thanks without speech. Clara stood rooted, her heart racing. Fear prickled her skin, yet the firelight threw strange clarity on the scene before her. Elias, scarred and solemn, standing watch over a man his neighbors would call enemy. Mary, fearless, offering comfort without hesitation. The Apache man sat silent, but the gratitude in his eyes shone as bright as the flames. In that fragile balance of warmth and storm, Clara sensed a possibility she had not thought the land could hold, that dignity might be found not in suspicion, but in mercy. 4 days, the man stayed in the shed, recovering. He asked little, spoke less, though sometimes Clara caught him humming low, tuneless sounds as he sharpened Elias' tools or mended leather straps with skilled hands. Mary hovered around him as children do, curious and unafraid. Clara, torn between unease and pity, carried him bread and stew in tin bowls, setting them down without meeting his gaze. She felt his silence press back against her own, but it was not hostile. It was the silence of someone long accustomed to being judged before a word could be spoken. Then came the raids. 2 ranches burned to the west, and cattle were stolen in the night. In town, tongues wagged, quick to point fingers. Clara heard it in the mercantile. The stranger under Elias' roof was to blame, his kind always to blame. The men spoke loud enough for her to hear, as though daring her to defend him. She said nothing, but when she returned home, the weight of their suspicion clung to her like ash. That evening, Elias walked into town. Clara, restless, followed at a distance, unseen beneath her shawl. In the saloon, voices rose, fists slammed against tables. Elias stood at the bar, unshaken by their accusations. He let the noise wash over him, then spoke just once, his voice calm, carrying enough to still the room. A man's shelter is sacred. That was all. No explanation, no plea, no boast. He turned and left, his back unguarded, his silence stronger than any bullet. Clara stood in the doorway, unseen, her breath caught in her throat. In that moment she saw him as more than a grieving widower bound by his own shadows. He was a man who lived by a code unbent by fear or rumor, a man who offered protection not because it was safe, but because it was right. And she felt something shift within her, not the easing of fear, not yet, but the first quiet stirring of respect, deep and unshakable. The snow did not ease. Day after day it fell, burying fences, bending trees under its weight, turning paths to the barn into narrow trenches dug with shovels and stubborn will. The air grew so cold that Clara's breath hung in clouds inside the house, drifting near the window panes frosted with ice. Food dwindled. What Elias had stored from harvest thinned too quickly, and Clara stretched what remained with broth, bread made from coarse flour, potatoes softened in ash. They ate in silence more often than not, each of them measuring what was left. Sharing one roof became its own trial. The house was too small to keep distance, too quiet to ignore one another completely. Clara moved about with her shawl wrapped close, the wool brushing past Elias' arm as he passed her in the kitchen, or grazing his scarred knuckles when he reached for wood by the fire. The touch was fleeting, accidental, yet heavy with awareness. His eyes lingered longer than they once had, not boldly, but as though he were trying to remember something lost. In lamplight, his gaze would catch on her face and slide away, leaving her skin warmed and unsettled. One evening, Mary carried her comb and ribbons to Clara, asking for her hair to be braided. Clara's fingers worked gently through the tangles, weaving strands into order, tying the ribbon with care. She glanced up to find Elias watching from his chair. His expression was unreadable, but for a heartbeat she caught a flicker, something tender, aching. A memory, perhaps, of a woman whose braid he kept hidden in a box. Clara lowered her eyes quickly, afraid to trespass on what was not hers, yet her heart beat fast all the same. The tension between them grew not from words, but from the weight of all that was unsaid. Clara feared rejection like a shadow always behind her, feared that if she leaned too far into this fragile bond, he might push her away as easily as others had. Yet Elias' small gestures spoke differently. A cup of coffee poured into her hands before she asked. His coat draped across her shoulders when she stepped outside to fetch water. Boots placed near the fire so they would not freeze stiff in the night. He gave these things without a word, as though care itself could be offered in silence. Then came the night the barn roof gave way. Snow had piled heavy all day, and as the wind rose sharp, a crack like a gunshot split the air. Elias rushed from the hearth, pulling on his coat. Clara followed, shawl clutched around her, feet sinking in drifts. The barn sagged, timbers groaning, animals thrashing in panic inside. Together they hauled open the doors, the stench of sweat and fear pouring into the frozen night. Clara stumbled into the dark with Elias at her side, lantern swinging in his grip. The work was desperate, unrelenting. Snow crashed from above as they led horses out one by one, shouting against the storm. A cow's rope tangled, and Clara, trembling, cut it loose with Elias' knife while he braced the beam that threatened to fall. Her hands burned with cold, her breath came ragged, but she did not falter. Side by side they worked until the animals stood safe in the yard, steam rising from their hides, hooves stamping in the snow. Only then did they collapse against the outer wall, lanterns sputtering between them. Elias looked at her through the darkness, his scar lined with frost, his chest heaving. She met his gaze, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her hands raw and trembling. For the first time he seemed to see her not as a guest, not as a burden, but as a woman forged strong by survival. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Still, his silence was full, not empty. They trudged back to the house together, boots soaked, shoulders brushing. Inside, Clara peeled off her wet shawl, and Elias draped his blanket over her without asking. She sat near the fire, staring into the flames, her heart caught between fear and something that felt dangerously close to hope. She realized she was no longer invisible in this house. And Elias, watching her from the chair where he had grieved for so long, realized he could not remain entombed in his sorrow forever. Spring came late that year, as though winter refused to surrender its hold. The snow melted in jagged patches, revealing fields flattened by frost and fences bowed beneath months of weight. Rivers swelled with thaw, running high and fast, carrying branches and whole trees down from the mountains. With the thaw came movement, men riding the roads again, cattle driven from valley to pasture, and with them the murmur of old grudges. Elias repaired what he could, shoulders bent over split rails, hands cracked and scarred. Clara worked beside him, clearing the yard, planting early rows with fingers still stiff from the cold. Mary skipped between them, chasing sunlight, her laughter carrying faint hope across the land. Yet the peace that came with spring was thin, fragile, like glass held over fire. Clara felt it in the way Elias' eyes narrowed toward the horizon, in the stillness that fell over him when a rider passed too near. The trouble came one evening as dusk lowered over the ranch. 3 men rode up, faces shadowed by wide hats, rifles across their saddles. Clara recognized them from town, the same who had spat her name like a curse, who whispered she was bad luck. Their leader, a man with yellowed teeth and a voice slick with spite, leaned forward in his saddle and said Elias' land was wasted on him, that he had no right to keep it. Elias stood on the porch, arms folded, saying nothing. Clara felt the familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest, but this time it did not send her running. She stepped down from the porch, shawl wrapped close, her rifle steady in her hands. She placed herself beside Elias, the willow tree behind them creaking in the wind. Her heart pounded, but her stance did not break. The men laughed, their mockery carried on the spring breeze. But when one reached for his rifle, the laughter died. Gunfire cracked, shattering the dusk, sparks leaping from the barrels. Horses screamed, hooves tore the earth. Clara raised her weapon, hands shaking but firm, and fired into the night. The recoil stung her shoulder, smoke burned her eyes, but she did not falter. Elias fired beside her, steady, sure, his presence a wall that did not bend. The fight burned quick and fierce, like dry grass catching flame. When it was over, silence fell heavy, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of fire where a lantern had shattered against the barn wall. The men fled into the dark, leaving blood in the dust, curses trailing after them. Clara stood trembling, her shawl torn by a grazing shot, her hands raw against the rifle's stock. The smoke stung her throat, and tears, born of fear, of fury, of release, blurred her vision. Elias turned to her then. He did not speak, not at first. His eyes searched her face as though seeing it truly for the first time, the dirt streaked across her cheek, the loose strands of hair clinging to her skin, the strength that had carried her through fire and gunpowder. Slowly, he reached out, his rough hand covering hers where it clutched the rifle. His grip was firm, steady, not to take the weapon from her, but to steady her trembling. In the quiet after the gunfire, their breath rose and fell together. The fire between them was no longer just danger, it was survival, shared and earned. Clara felt the truth rise in her chest, stronger than fear. She belonged, not because Elias had claimed her, not because Mary had needed her, but because she had stood her ground when all else urged her to yield. Elias' silence broke then, not with words, but with the touch of his hand over hers. A recognition. A vow unspoken. His heart, long shielded behind grief and stone, had opened just enough to let her in. The town could not hold its tongue. By the next morning, every porch, every saloon table, Every cracked church bench carried whispers of what had happened at the ranch. Some called it folly, that a widower and a discarded bride had stood against men with nothing to lose. Others, quieter, spoke of courage. Clara felt the weight of both kinds of words when she went to market. A woman spat near her boots. Another pressed a loaf of bread into her hands without a word, eyes lowered in respect. Elias listened but did not bend. Rumor was smoke, it drifted where it wished, but the truth had weight, and he knew it must be carried. One dawn, with the sky pale and raw as cut stone, he saddled his horse. Clara woke to the sound of leather straps tightening, of metal buckles clinking. She stepped onto the porch, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and saw the rifle strapped to his saddle. "You'll not ride alone," she said. He did not argue. Perhaps he had expected her words. Perhaps he had longed for them. She saddled her own horse, hand steady, and when Mary came running barefoot into the chill air, Clara bent low and promised she would return. The child's arms clung to her waist as though to a tree in a flood, and Elias watched, eyes shadowed, before lifting Mary gently to the porch. They rode into town as the sun broke, two figures side by side, their breath rising in the cold morning light. Doors opened, curtains twitched, men leaned on railings to watch. The ringleaders were waiting at the saloon, their faces half swallowed by smoke and drink. Elias dismounted without flourish, his boots sounding hard against the dust-packed ground. Clara stood beside him, her hand brushing her shawl where beneath it her old wedding dress clung, mended, whole again, a quiet defiance of what had once been broken. The leader sneered, words thick with contempt. "Thought we taught you your place." Elias said nothing at first, letting the silence burn hotter than any retort. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, clear as water over stone. "This land's mine. This woman stands here because she's stronger than the lot of you. You've done enough harm. There'll be no more." Clara stepped forward then, her voice carrying though her hands trembled. "You tried to shame me, to call me bad luck, worthless, unfit. But you were wrong. I worked the earth, I faced your bullets, and I did not break. I will not hang my head for men who have never stood where I've stood." The saloon quieted. Men shifted, eyes dropping, their bluster shriveling before the rawness of truth. The ringleaders found no words, no excuse strong enough to mask their shame. One by one, their gazes fell to the dirt. No shots were fired, no blood spilled, yet the reckoning was heavier than iron. Justice stood not in a duel, but in the dignity that could not be stolen from her. When Elias and Clara turned to leave, no one blocked their path. Heads bowed as they passed, not in worship, but in recognition. The ride home carried a stillness different from the one that had once haunted them. Mary sat nestled between them on Elias' horse, her laughter scattering like birds startled into flight. Clara's shawl slipped open in the breeze, the white fabric of her wedding dress catching the sunlight. It was not the same garment she had once worn into despair. It was patched, worn, stronger than before, like her own heart. For a long while, Elias rode in silence, as was his way. The road stretched out, familiar and endless, the land scarred yet alive. Then, near the bend where the willows arched overhead, he spoke. "You were not sent from heaven, Clara," he said, voice steady but softer than she had ever heard. "You were sent here." Clara looked at him, the weight of years of shame and longing loosening like knots undone. The home she had sought was not in the clouds nor in the promises of men who broke them. It was here, on this scarred land, with this man who had loved in silence until the silence broke. Mary leaned against her, humming some tuneless melody only a child could carry. The road wound on, but for the first time, Clara felt it was carrying her home.